we'll go ahead and get started. A couple of just general guidelines for those of you who are hoping to ask questions. We want to have plenty of time to do that. I have muted everybody as the host, just so that there's no background noise. I have a fan on in here, so everyone probably, hopefully it's not too loud, but if everybody's background noise came in, it might be a little distracting. We'll have plenty of opportunities to chat as a group towards the end. I was going to start by inviting Dr. Levine to do just kind of an introduction to the piece that we're talking about today, Her Stories, which recently came out from Duke. And then we'll talk a little bit, she and I have a couple of questions I prepared. And at any point, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. So if you, I believe you hover over, your screen, your Zoom screen, and you'll see a button that says chat. You can put your comment in the chat. And once we get to that point in the conversation, I'll start moderating the chat. And, you know, I'm imagining, I've put in the event listing, this will go until 5. If people have lots of things they want to talk about, we could go a little bit later, but of course you're welcome to come and go as you need to do. But I don't imagine we'll go much later than 5:15 Central. So I think that's everything. Oh, please, you can send a direct message, but it's best, I think, if you send your chat to everybody. That way we can all see the questions. You could also maybe just directly send it to me. Don't send it directly to Elana because she will be using her brain to talk, and I will be the one watching for the questions as they come in and helping field them. So without further ado, let's get started. I think I might just, first of all, congratulate you on this book. It's a wonderful achievement, I think. And it's really an intervention into television history in a lot of ways. It places soaps at the center of this history, a forum that is often marginalized in the way that we talk about the emergence of television in the network era. So I'm a television scholar as well, and I found it really compelling the way you talk about how soaps are central to everything we think about as central to TV history. The emergence of new advertising models, the move away from sponsor-produced programs, the consolidation of network power in the 60s. So those were some of the things that I thought were amazing about this book, but I would like to invite you to just give us a little bit of context for the work and talk about what you see as the project and maybe tell us why it's so wonderful.
Thank you, Maureen. This is really kind of you. All your words have been very kind, and inviting me to do this is great, and I'm really happy to be able to do this with C21 in particular. That was such an important space for me as I worked on this project over actually 2 different fellowships over the years I was working on this. So as you say, the book is really meant to offer a historical view of the American daytime television soap opera from its origins and its transition from radio to television in the late 40s and early 50s, really to the present. And that's quite, a broad time frame for media scholarship. Other kinds of history obviously takes on bigger timeframes, but media scholarship tends to take on smaller timeframes. And so that was part of the challenge of the project for me, was to use it by taking the focus on soap opera, trying to study all of TV history through this lens. Now, I'm a TV scholar and a TV historian kind of fundamental to begin with. And so it was kind of bringing this was an attempt to bring what I understand about television history and kind of intersect that with what I understand about soap opera and women's forms of popular media culture in general, and try to see where those 2 things fit together or not, and how they kind of influence each other. And to really try it kind of almost as a thought experiment, what does it mean if you think about the history of this major media form of American television, and particularly American broadcast network television, which has of its history. It's of course changing quite a bit in the present. If you think about that history through the lens of a program form that is marginalized, denigrated, associated with women, dismissed, seen as inartful, all of the things that we could talk about the reputation of soap opera, and instead really try to think about, well, what does it tell us about itself? It's about soap opera. The book is very much about soap opera and how this form changes over time, but it's also about how ideas about women and women's culture change over this long time period of the second half of the 20th century and the beginning years of the 21st century. And then, of course, what is the intersection between that and American television more broadly? So it's really bringing those different kinds of elements together and trying to understand all of them, which was a big task to take on.
Yes, it is really an ambitious project. I mean, I was struck by that reading it. And it's ambitious in the sense not only of the timeline, as you describe. Most scholars try to take on a smaller chunk and focus on that. So it's ambitious in terms of timeline, but it's also, it does what I consider to be kind of a classic cultural studies. It uses what I would call a classic cultural studies approach, in the sense that it's trying to look at every moment in the life cycle of a media object. So it looks at the industrial context, right, of like, how are producers thinking about their work? It looks at the texts themselves. You have very, I would say, thorough and wide-ranging analysis of individual episodes of soap operas, of the kind of aesthetics of the soap operas themselves. So you look at the texts themselves, and then you also try to get at reception, sort of like how people talked about those things as they were watching them, and what did audiences kind of, what did they think of these texts? So that's, I think, really hard work to do. It's a reason that cultural studies methods usually, they can be too difficult to do all of those things at once, or if you try to, I don't know, I try to do that sometimes and I feel like I don't get at each of those three things successfully. So I wonder if you can talk about that. Did it feel like you were taking on a lot, and how did you balance those different moments in the circuit of culture production?
Thank you. Thank you for noticing that. Yes, it's, I'm very, devoted to that idea of thinking about really any cultural form in terms of that sort of cultural circuit model. And so that's always really important to me, and not just to kind of isolate texts outside of their contexts. And so, I mean, I bring that perspective to all of my work, but it was really important to me to do that for this project because of the various interventions I wanted to make and the way that I wanted to talk about soap opera in the context of television more broadly. And to me, to talk about television without talking about its kind of industrial functions and commercial functions is, at least in the American context, is really missing its fundamental role and function, right? Because it's fundamentally, there to sell products, to provide us as audiences for advertisers. And so to me, that is always essential for thinking about, at least again, American commercial television, thinking about that context. But also what's interesting to me about television is about its intersection with the broader culture. And so to get at that, you have to think about broader cultural trends, and you have to think about the actual people who are engaging with it. And so I always try to bring, that's sort of the model I would always approach any object that I would study from that model. But as you say, sometimes you can't do all of those things. And, I think the book is more kind of industry and text oriented, I would say, and kind of context in a really broad sense about changing patterns and discourses around gender in particular, but also around other aspects of identity like race and sexuality. And then, the audience part is always, I think, really important. I mean, this is why this stuff matters, is because people actually watch it and are invested in it. But that's, of course, the most challenging to get at historically. So anyways, once I knew I wanted to take that approach and to really give soap opera the kind of attention and sort of seriousness of attention that thinking about it in this really comprehensive way allowed. But I knew that was a big lift. But, I think it was deciding to approach the book chronologically helped. It kind of gave me a through line. And then after that, it was about thinking about any given, how to periodize within that chronology, and then how to think about any given time period and how to divide up. So I say it's chronological, but it's not that every chapter moves on in years. I'll have often have two chapters that will cover the same time period. And I tried in those to sort of somewhat divide up the questions that I was looking at, in having some chapters that deal more explicitly with production practices and industrial pressures, and some chapters that deal more with stories and characters and sort of social cultural context with audience kind of threaded throughout. But it was that was a messy mishmash that had to get kind of massaged one way or the other at various points. It was not so clear cut, because the whole point is that all those things are interact and intersect with each other. So finding ways to divide them and have a through line for chapters was probably one of the biggest challenges, I think. And then like just kind of corralling the data, the information, the like rich body of stuff that I've found out in my research.
Yes, I want to turn to that actually,
Mm-hmm.
the body of material that you were drawing from, because it is so extremely comprehensive. I mean, you state in the introduction, or maybe it's the preface, that you are a soap fan yourself, and you've been following these storylines for a really long time on certain shows. And you rely on the fan practices of others too. So I would love for you to talk to us about your archive, like what it is that where you're finding the materials that you're looking at. So I know that you look at fan practices and you have, certain people who have sent you tapes, but you also maybe had access to network archives too that allowed you to see scripts and those sort of things. So just tell us sort of how you got all of the material you were working with.
Thank you. I could talk about that, for 100 hours. So, because that's just, the nerdy kind of historian impulse. But it really depends on what kind of information we're talking about. And so I'll try to maybe address it in different categories. Like for the programs themselves, some episodes of soap opera just simply don't exist in video form anymore. Many were broadcast live in the 1950s and even throughout the 60s, some soaps. And so they just disappeared into the air as they aired. And then some soaps started to be recorded on videotape beginning in the 60s, but videotape formats change over time. And so a lot of, even if somebody had managed to preserve something from the 60s, it might not be watchable now because it was recorded on a different format. I mean, this is technical stuff, but it's kind of important to how you actually get to do this stuff. That said, there are some surviving episodes from those periods, and some archives have some, kind of have what exists, and then there's some stuff that just happens to appear on the internet. Who knows how or where or why somebody got their hands on that and posted it. But so there's all those things. It was kind of easy to see what was available from like the 50s through the 70s, really, because it's sort of limited. It gets complicated from the 80s on because that's the era when fans start to have VCRs. And there are soap fans who recorded and saved every episode. And of course, let's just like make sure everyone's clear. This is shows that are on every day, 5 days a week. By the mid 70s, many of them were an hour long a day. So, I mean, that's an incredible amount of content. And yet there's people who, have preserved these things just out of their kind of fan practices. So that was a big resource for me for finding actual episodes of things from that period on, basically from the very late 70s or early 80s on. And so that, some of that is available online that people have, the fans have uploaded to YouTube or other sites. Some of it I got through kind of fan collectors who exchange material in offline networks. Some of it is my own stuff that I've saved since I was a teenage soap fan in the 80s, or that over the years, because I was always interested in writing about soaps, I would just record and save. And so that's the program aspect of things. There are some stories that I write about that I haven't been able to see episodes, but I was able to read scripts. So if I talked about anything in detail, I either was able to watch the episodes or was able to read scripts from it. And there's some amazing archives of scripts in conventional archives. And that is connected to another set of the materials that I was able to draw on, which are collections associated either with writers or with really only one network, NBC, and they don't really have much from the 60s on. It's the NBC collection, which is at the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison, ends around the early 60s. And sponsors, so Procter & Gamble, the large, commercial domestic goods company, owned and sponsored many daytime soap operas. They have a very small archival collection that's available in Madison. They probably have a lot more internally, but they've never made that public. But those papers are a good resource. One or two, directors who worked on soaps have collections. And so those resources were incredibly rich and valuable. And, the writers who were some of the most prominent writers who worked on multiple shows, who created their own shows, have archives where they've deposited their work. And they often have, epic tips and other things too that are really useful for the kind of production practices and industrial practices aspects of my research, like memos and correspondence and that sort of thing. Also things really useful to me, like the trade press for the television industry and the advertising industries. Those are really helpful for kind of understanding broader context. They don't cover soaps a ton. They did cover daytime television because there was an era where daytime television was incredibly important to the network business model. And so you do get sort of discussions of daytime more broadly, and then I could kind of find stuff about soaps within that. And then beginning in about the 70s, the soap opera fan magazines are available and they exist as of that point. They're hard to find as an archival resource, but those are really helpful. And there's a particular soap opera magazine that started in the 80s called Soap Opera Weekly that was sort of like the serious fan soap magazine that kind of talked about the industry and kind of analyzed the way soaps were handling different issues in kind of really in-depth ways that you don't expect from a fan magazine. So that publication in particular was really helpful for me in understanding certain things that were happening on the kind of business side. And then lots of secondary research about, American women's history and changing ideas about femininity and masculinity. And lots of secondary research on television history too, of course. And so those kinds of things are part of it. And I should just say about audiences, the fan magazines where they publish letters to the editor or sometimes columns written by fans, some online fan discourse is things I draw on for more recent stuff. And then in the archival manuscript collections, there's great collections of letters that fans would write into shows and to writers and stuff. And those are, so much fun. And also fan mail reports sometimes in some of the collections where the shows would have somebody who would basically tally up how many letters they got or what perspectives that people were writing in about. And of course, pre-internet, writing letters was a much more common practice. And so obviously it represents a relatively small segment of the audience, but you do get some really interesting perspectives that way when you're trying to understand how people actually responded to these things. So, I mean, that's a kind of broad sweep of the various different kinds of sources I draw on.
That's fabulous. The soap opera magazines just seem so fun. And it occurs to me as you're saying all of this that you have a collection and you were dealing with it while you were a fellow last year at the center. So would you like to talk a little bit about that collection?
Sure. So a couple of scholars that I know, Lee Harrington, and then it just disappeared. I'm so sorry, everybody. I hope that wasn't too disruptive. I'm not sure what the last thing you heard. Did you hear me say anything about the magazines?
You had just started to name the people you got the collection from. I think that's what.
Okay.
Oh no.
Okay. All right. I'm going to talk in hopes that you hearing me still?
Yes, you froze again for a second, but
okay.
You're okay now.
All right. Okay. So magazines. So Lee Harrington and Denise Bilby had contacted me about their magazines, and they sent them to me, and I had this incredibly large collection. I didn't realize how many magazines it was going to be. And these were like full runs of a number of soap magazines from about the 80s on. And eventually I was able to, once I kind of made sense of them, and figured out what was there, was able to donate a bunch of them to Bowling Green State University's Popular Culture Library, where I had been previously to do research on this myself, and knew that they had a lot. They were sort of one of the places that had a substantial collection of soap opera fan magazines, but didn't have a complete listing. I didn't have a complete collection of them. And so I was able to kind of fill in the gaps in their collection that they didn't have, which is great. You know, they can do better job of preserving those than I can. And I've, you know, been playing around, and I was as a fellow thinking about ways to maybe do some digital kind of platform with the magazines. And part of the problem are the copyright issues, and that they're, you know, they're not in the public domain, and sort of ran into like a number of obstacles in thinking about that. So I'm glad that they're kind of in the hands of a proper archive that can preserve them and treat them well and have them there for others who might want to read these things.
Yeah. And popular culture, it's such a fraught terrain for archives, because people don't necessarily know how to archive ephemeral or popular texts. And there's not always a sense that they're valued. And certainly with soap operas, that's at play.
For sure. I mean, and that's definitely true for the magazines, which are not, you know, there's like 2 libraries that have any substantial collection of soap opera fan magazines. And sometimes you just happen upon a public library that has a run of a certain publication for a certain time period. But it's hard to know if those are going to be preserved. So that's true of the magazines, but you know, that's even true of the episodes, right? I mean, this is true of television in general. Like there's no archive that is kind of preserving all television by any means. And, you know, even archives that may have some episodes of older soaps from, let's say the 70s that were often saved on tape formats. Like I was talking about the tape formats earlier that are very hard to access now because there's like only a handful of machines left that can even play those tapes. And that makes it really tricky for preservation and being able to access these things as researchers.
Right. I'd like to ask you about the role of women producers, creators in the soap opera industry. I mean, I was struck as I was reading, you mention a fair amount of women involved in the writing of soap opera, especially Irma Phillips. Am I getting it right? Irma Phillips?
Yeah, Irma Phillips.
Yep. Yeah, and that was kind of early in the period of women having careers, you know, it being socially acceptable for women to have careers in television. So I'd love for you to talk about how you found women in the archives, and if it was something you had to search particularly hard for. Were there lots of women working in soap opera, the industry? And related to that, I mean, so much about soap opera's kind of popular reception is that it's, and I'll rephrase. One thing about how you talk about soap operas and how scholars talk about soap operas that is important is how they're totally suffused with the way that male producers are trying to imagine women and like what women want and what they need. And I just wonder if it makes a difference that women are also involved in the work of that imagining and how it shapes the soap operas that get written.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So it's not hard to find women creators in soap opera history because there's a lot of them. Not exclusively. There's men who have been really important creators. I should say another thing about soap opera that's kind of distinct in terms of how television works and how a lot of moving image media work, at least, is that the writers are really the kind of most powerful entity in the kind of creative process. I mean, that's true in television more generally, but in primetime television, writers and producers are the same role, basically. And in soap opera, those duties are separated, where producers really focus on the day-to-day production, and writers really focus on the creative development story. So soap opera is a little distinct in that way. And so the writers, again, there's some prominent male writers, but there's lots of women who have been really significant writers, and also couples, married couples, male-female couples have been head writers of a lot of soaps, which is something I'm interested in now and thinking about more. It's not something I get into detail about, like that particular configuration, or really I sort of take the women writers' perspectives, obviously are really important to the story I'm telling in the book, but I'm not really focused on them as women writers so much. But that's a question I am interested in thinking more about now. Anyways, Erna Phillips, who you mentioned, is in many ways kind of the creator of the form of soap opera. She created soap operas in radio in the early 1930s. And so she is, I mean, there's a couple of other players who were kind of starting to do this kind of writing at the same time, but she's one of the most significant ones. And so she then transitions to television in the late 40s, and she has a fabulous collection of her work that's at the Wisconsin Historical Society. And so she is a really key figure, and she was sort of the person who then went on to train a number of other really prominent writers. So she created the shows like The Guiding Light in radio, which then transferred to TV, and As the World Turns, which she created for TV, but was on for many decades. And she trained sort of the next generation of folks. Some really two prominent people, one, Bill Bell, who created The Young and the Restless, and The Bold and the Beautiful, and Agnes Nixon, who created All My Children and One Life to Live. And those two were really important figures, and both have papers like that are available in libraries, in archives. And so like it's a very, in some ways, soap opera, the world of soap opera creation is a very small world. So even though so much about soap opera is so voluminous in terms of the content of the programs themselves, the players behind the scenes are a pretty small group, and they're much like in a soap, there's a lot of like familial lineage or ancestral lineage there, at least in terms of Phillips having trained the next generation, et cetera. And so there's other players there who are not, directly in that line of descent, but that are, also follow these kind of generational lines. And so it's very parallel to the kind of story world of soap opera in that way. But, the fact that this was a place where women had a lot of opportunity creatively is not that surprising, given that it's a form that was always understood as a form for women, that was directed towards women, housewives initially. And even though the audience eventually, and maybe probably always, was broader than just that idea of women, or just that idea of housewives, or just that idea of the white middle class housewife, that was always the kind of value proposition of the shows, was that they were going to appeal to these audiences so that they could deliver advertisements for products that those women would be buying. And so in that way, I think that helps to explain a little bit of the ways that women had this kind of function and power in that system, is that it was seen as a women's form, and it was also seen as sort of a kind of under the radar form. And so I think that that's part of it too, is that it wasn't like making a woman the president of the network, but it was giving some of these women an incredible amount of power in the things that were actually helping to sustain the business of the networks themselves. And so there's that, it's kind of at what level are the women involved. There are some women who were involved in production early on, or even there's some well-known women directors of soaps even in the 50s. Again, more men than women, but there were women doing stuff like that, which you don't think of as typically, feminized roles. And so it's a space where I think women in the TV industry have always had a little bit more opportunity, I think, than elsewhere. And that, that's still true to some extent today, although I think that there's lots of, men in the contemporary world of soaps who have a lot of that power and authority. But so it's not hard to find, because that's who was there. That's who was making these shows.
That's really interesting. And then related to that, I think you talk about how, there's this tight connection between how producers and writers thought about women and how we think of it as a uniquely gendered form of television. And one of the and there's a lot of scholarship in television studies about the housewife and the soap opera. And you build on that, but you also kind of offer something different in that you allow for you look at that very carefully over time. And you really argue, I think, that the way that producers and writers conceptualize the housewife and domestic labor and the woman and what women as a block, you know, needed and wanted from soap operas, that also changes over time. So I'd love it if you could talk about that change.
Yeah, that was one of my, like, the sort of most exciting elements of what I was able to piece together, because I mean, the legacy of scholarship on soap opera, which is amazing, sort of, you know, why I was able to do this, and is, you know, my work is so much built on. At the same time, that scholarship tends to talk about soap opera in a very kind of ahistorical way, as if it functions one way of all time. And I suspected that probably wasn't the case, because I knew that soaps, in terms of their content and the kinds of stories they told and their kind of cultural circulation, varied over time. And so it seemed to me that certain things about who was watching and how they conceived of themselves was surely likely to change too, and how the industry conceived of them even. And so even as early as the 50s, there's some really interesting shifts that I was able to tease out. For example, I mean, a big argument in broadcasting, American broadcasting industry, is that the broadcast networks, which at the time were ABC, NBC, and CBS only, were very reluctant to develop daytime television, because daytime radio was a very lucrative part of their business model. And on daytime radio, you had soap operas, as well as other kinds of programming, obviously. And, you know, that was true. And of course, if you think about it, if the idea was trying to reach housewives, the idea was that they could be doing their housework while they listened to the radio. But the belief that people had about TV, that it really required very careful, close attention visually. And so the concern was that women weren't going to watch TV soap operas because they would be too busy doing their housework. And so what I found is that the industry had to kind of reconceptualize, rethink their understanding of women in the home and of house, in order to justify kind of getting into the business of daytime TV and putting TV at all. And so I knew about the reluctance, and I definitely saw some of that reluctance there, but then I couldn't let go of the question of, like, well, then how did it happen? Like, why did it shift? And part of it is because of the kind of value to television, right? So the advertisers got super excited about television because they could show these products, and they thought it was a really effective selling tool. But there's also that they had to kind of think about housework a little bit differently. And I found some really interesting discourses of the advertising and commercial goods and TV industries starting to talk about housework itself as being actually not so hard, not so time consuming. And maybe women could just, like, not do it some points during the day and sit and watch their soap operas. So they didn't really take away the idea that that TV required close attention. They held on to that because that suited their interests, of course. But they shifted the way they thought about what women were doing in the home, to think about, well, they had housework to do, but housework's not that important, not that serious, not that difficult, and they could just stop it at some points. And they also really started to justify what they were doing as giving a kind of almost like a psychological service to the housewife, helping her to deal with her problems and to feel better about her world and her life by watching soap operas. And so there's some real interesting discourses around the kind of psychologization of TV, daytime TV watching that happens in that era, in that kind of post-war period. So lots of fascinating stuff there. But really across the history of the form, you see these changing ideas about the audience because the world was changing, right? So as women started to move more and more into the workforce, the industry started to design programs that appeal to younger audiences, like teenagers and kids even. And over the 70s and 80s, you see this really big growth in really young viewers and people getting really invested in watching soaps at a much younger age. Sometimes they were watching with their mothers or grandmothers or fathers or whomever, but they were kids were getting involved at an earlier age. So that started to shift the conception of the audience in some ways. In lots of ways, through till the present, the industry needs to think about women as its audience because that's who their advertisers, when I say industry, I mean the TV business, because that's who their advertisers want to reach or think is valuable. I found this really interesting statistic from the 2000s, like relatively recently, about a really 30-some% of the audience being male for soap operas, which if you start to study the history of soaps, you see that there's a much broader, more diverse audience than the assumptions have been. But the TV business is like, well, it doesn't really matter that there's, 35% of the audience is male, because we can't sell that to the advertisers, don't want to try and sell to them. And so they keep selling, domestic goods. And so there's that kind of mismatch between who's actually there and who they know is there or think they know is there and who they want to sell as being there. So very complicated layers of assumptions about the actual real people who are doing the watching.
So interesting. And I realized we have a bunch of really fun questions coming in the Q&A. I think I'll just ask one more at this point, which is about, because we haven't hit yet on the narrative structure stuff of soap operas. And I just personally want to ask you about the 80s. I mean, you talk in your chapter on the 80s about how it was this high watermark that was soon to crest in terms of in terms of soap operas profitability and therefore their kind of cultural influence and how much budget they were given. And so the 80s is like this really glitzy era of soap culture, and like Luke and Laura, the whole storyline with Luke and Laura kind of was this, it was everywhere, and it just seemed like they were really culturally at a high watermark. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that, and maybe also, do you have a sense that the glitz and glamour of the soap opera in that moment was woven into the fabric of 80s culture or 80s television culture, or what was that about?
Yeah, the 80s is such a fun period, and it's the only time period in the chapter in the book that I talk about in like just one chapter, but it's like a relatively narrow time period and all the different elements of it go into one chapter. And I really see it as kind of the hinge point of the book, because it's both kind of, as you said, the peak of the popularity and profitability of soap opera, and which means that it's kind of like things start to decline from there in a way that makes the form less prominent, less powerful, less profitable, less popular from then on. And so it's a really interesting moment, like in terms of a historical peak, but it's also an interesting moment because the soaps were like crazy fun in the 80s. I mean, that's when you started to get all of this kind of genre hybridity. I say you start. There's things, as a historian, nothing is like the first. Like there's lots of moments before that lead to this point. But you have, science fiction stories and action adventure stories and, all kinds of sort of stretching the bounds of what we think of as soap opera in this era. You also have, as you say, kind of glitz and glamour, and that like the production values increase. I mean, it's still a relatively inexpensive form of TV production compared to others, but they start to spend more money on wardrobe, and they start to invest more in the sets and things like that, and just have it kind of have a higher end look. They go on location more and do shooting outside the studio, which if you were a soap fan in the 80s, that was like super exciting when they would be out in the real world. And so all these things all have precedence in the 70s and sometimes in the 60s, but in the 80s they really become sort of age. It also is the era of the super couple, which are these like young, almost always white couples who fall in love and have adventures and solve crimes and do all kinds of exciting things together in ways that made soaps of these massive popular sensations at the time. And so there's fascinating stuff about kind of gender roles and gender identity that's getting expressed in those stories. And also this real kind of like turn away from sort of serious social issues, which had been really prominent in the soaps in the 70s. And I mean, when you think about, 80s culture writ large and the kind of Reagan years glitz and glamour sort of, turn away from a lot of the social upheavals of the 60s and 70s, it makes sense. And I think that that's part of what's going on. And it really is sort of the start of this kind of more neoconservative era that indeed, begins at that point. And I think you can kind of see that reflected in the soaps. And yet at the same time, it's this incredibly fun and loved period for lots of soap fans. And so it's a really fascinating moment. And, you definitely get some of your best, clips and moments come from the 80s. when the hair was big and the the stories were exciting.
Yeah. Although I have to say, I didn't know about Luke and Laura. I mean, I'm a little young to have known about Luke and Laura in the moment, but I was researching after I was reading your book, and I was like, Luke did not look the way I thought he would look. And he seems in some way kind of like not the traditional, you think about soap operas having a certain type as the like,
oh yeah,
hunky protagonist. I thought that was interesting. I was like,
no, it was a big part of what was distinctive about it was that he was so not the typical leading man. Like, he's not that conventionally handsome. He, like, he was sort of goofy. He, he had that like soap opera hero look, and but he's very charming and has this very like loose sensibility and sense of humor, and it really but I think it was a sign of the way that the types of the soap opera hero and heroine were starting to change in that period, and because Luke and Laura were so incredibly popular, that typology has a big influence across the form.
That's so great. Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to the Q&A from the audience. There's a lot of good questions. So I'll start just chronologically. The first one is from Jessica Hoover. And she asked, do you think there are any issues regarding collections of scripts or creator archives because women were more involved in the making of soap operas? Are there fewer of them, or does that not seem to be an issue?
I actually think there may be more. Like, I think it was sort of surprising, and I don't know that that has anything to do with it being women, but I was very, pleasantly surprised at how much was available in script archives and in, manuscript archives from some of the writers. And it's even though in some ways it's a very challenging form to research, it has a really rich archive that is, in some parts of it are very accessible, like these manuscript archives. And so I'm not quite sure what explains that. I think maybe it might just be volume, because these folks have the shows are so voluminous, and they retain this kind of volume of material. And maybe that may have inspired some of these folks to donate their materials to archives, because they just had a lot of it, or it's inspired their descendants to donate because they had a lot of it. And so I don't know, it's an interesting question. That would be that would be another fun kind of offshoot project, would be to research kind of what inspired these kinds of materials to make their way into archives. But I think it's actually a surprisingly well-documented form in lots of ways. And maybe some primetime television is probably not as well formed. So yeah, that would be an interesting, I would need to understand more about what isn't available across all of TV to be able to try and speculate more about it, but it's quite well documented, at least in terms of paper.
Yeah. That's great. So next is from BH. BH asks, were you able to do any demographic study of the fans of soap opera?
Not exactly, because I don't, there's like not really a good way to access that kind of information. And even what the industry thinks about who their audience is shaped by ratings systems and audience research systems, which have lots of limitations in terms of actually getting at the real people involved. So I have more anecdotal kind of things, like I can see in soap opera fan magazines from the 70s, lots of letters from people who identify as male or identify as a teenager or something like that. And so you get that kind of thing, and other sorts of spaces. In the later eras, when you start to have an online fandom, you start to see like lots of, primarily gay men who are, talking a lot about soaps or having spaces online where they demonstrate their soap fandom. So there's that kind of, you can see those kinds of moments, and you see certain things here and there in the more conventional spaces of research that identify this. But I think it's hard to really nail that down in any one way.
That's great. The next question is actually related to the fan mail issue that you brought up. R. Ren Dalton is asking a quick question about fan mail. You mentioned these fan mail reports that I'm assuming, maybe wrongly, occurred during the soap operas themselves. How much did fan mail influence the showrunners? I guess broadly, how participatory was the televised content itself? That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, key thing about soaps, at least in earlier eras, was that they were able to respond to the audience as people, expressed their happiness or dishappiness with various kinds of developments. And there's some examples in soap history where the creators would shift gears if something was not popular amongst audiences. Often it's more like, once a story is written, they're probably not going to rewrite the whole thing. That's a lot of labor, but they would maybe not keep one of the characters around, would write them off and move the other character into a new direction or something like that if they saw that something was not working or was not as popular as they'd hoped. So there definitely is that kind of back and forth. Again, at least in, I think, earlier eras, I think it would be more challenging to be able to point to that now, although my guess is there's some of that. But in some ways, the industry has more access than they could possibly deal with fan response now because of social media. And I think it's almost too much, and they can't process it because there's so much of it, and they can't even, it was almost easier when they had physical letters coming into the studio that could be, tallied. And in a way, there's almost too much fan response now. And there's so many ways that it can be artificially manipulated through, people campaigning and stuff. So I think it might be even harder now, even though the fans are so much more visible and vocal, it might be even harder now for them to have an impact on production and story, because it's too much for the shows to be able to measure. I hadn't thought about it in those terms before. So thank you for that question. That's interesting.
Great. Next is from Kate Flack. I may or may not be pronouncing your last name correctly. I'm sorry, Kate. But Kate asks, do you think that because soaps kind of flew under the radar of network execs, that it allowed soap writers, many of whom were women, to incorporate themes and topics that challenged conventional gender norms, or even taboo topics such as abortion, sexuality, etc.? That's a great question, because I had wanted, and we didn't get to it, but I wanted to ask you about the prevalence of rape storylines. So,
right. There's lots of storylines dealing with women's bodies and sexuality, whether it's rape, abortion, pregnancy in general. The unwanted pregnancy or the surprise pregnancy is obviously a really important staple of lots of soap storytelling. And so the question was about whether the kind of under the radar-ness allowed for certain things. I think so, absolutely. Because in some way it changes at different time periods and with different shows. The shows that Procter & Gamble owned, Procter & Gamble is a very conservative corporation historically, and they had a lot of restrictions on what writers were allowed to do in their soaps. In the early days of As the World Turns in the mid-50s, there was a married male character who had an affair, and Procter & Gamble was very specific that if he was going to leave his wife for the other woman, he had to suffer terribly for this, or the other woman had to suffer terribly. They were not willing to condone this kind of behavior. And Erna Phillips, who was the writer, just decided to kill him off because she's like, I don't really need him. So she killed him off because she had to go along with what the owners, her bosses wanted, but she, didn't necessarily want to, punish one of the women involved. Anyways, so there's those moments, but then there's these moments in the late 60s and early 70s, particularly on Agnes Nixon's shows, when she got away with an amazing amount of stuff in terms of telling stories about abortion, race relations, lots of kind of pretty hot button issues of the day. And I think it's because she was, her shows were making a lot of money for ABC, she actually, I guess I should say, in those earlier, she actually owned her shows herself. And then she ended up selling them to ABC in the mid 70s, but ABC would have still, as the network would have still had a lot of say over what she was doing. But I think they kind of people are watching these shows, we're selling lots of ads time, it's working for us, let's go, and they just let her go. And they let her do a lot of things. And I had the pleasure of meeting Agnes Nixon before she passed away. And she told me that she did not get much opposition over the years from the network. They kind of let her do what she wanted. And she was very artful about being able to tell stories in ways that walked a very fine line that lots of different audiences from lots of different perspectives could kind of find acceptable, but certainly pushed a lot of boundaries that way. Maureen, you had asked about the rape stories. I mean, it was definitely like an era of like a lot of soap stories dealing with rape starting in the later mid to late 60s and through the 70s especially. And I actually wrote about this in a previous book in more detail than I do in the soap book. But yeah, I think it's very much in dialogue, at least in that era, it's very much in dialogue with the anti-rape movement. Some of the stories, especially in the earlier part of that period, are pretty, what we would consider today pretty problematic in terms of the way that they handle rape, certainly. But during that era, there's also lots of stories that were very much kind of advocating for, victims' rights and talking about the problems of the justice system when it came to prosecuting rapes. And, I mean, maybe not the kind of a 21st century kind of understanding of rape culture kind of talking about rape, although sometimes there were some discussions in different eras that were kind of starting to get at some of the systemic forces behind incidences of rape in a kind of rape culture, as we call it now, but, a really mixed bag of the way that these things were dealt with. And sometimes I think that was creators really trying to push particular kinds of political agendas, if you want to call it that, or social agendas. And sometimes it was just like, this is a kind of issue that is really the thing that people are thinking about and talking about now, and we want to be a part of that conversation. And we're going to make a story that engages in that conversation.
Okay. That's really interesting. And so the next question is asking similarly about potentially hot button issues or social issues, the kind of social relevancy that you describe. Michael Wilson is asking, well, first, Michael says, thank you, Elana, for this discussion.
You're welcome.
Can you offer a general overview of the representation of race and racial issues in soaps over the years? Did it reflect or challenge racial issues in their times? Also, I'm just curious if there were ever any American Indian characters in soaps. We watched All My Children in the 80s with Tad Martin, Dixie, Billy Clyde, Tuggo, etc.
Okay. I thought initially you were going to list a lot more characters, so I decided to take a drink. So, okay, American Indian characters, I'll answer that one first. As far as I know, no, except there is this character in the 90s or early 2000s on As the World Turns, who was a woman who was, I think, supposed to be some kind of American Indian character who plays this horribly, kind of racially problematic role. She's this kind of side character who's like, sage advice, helps the central white couple find their way back to each other or something. I mentioned it really briefly in the book. Primarily the non-white group that's represented in soap opera are African Americans, although that is quite limited in many parts of soap history. So definitely into the 60s, there's basically no characters of color at all, any non-white characters. What starts to happen is that in the 60s, really alongside a broader conversation in American television and American media and American culture, obviously, about race relations, there starts to be more characters of color, and particularly Black characters on soaps. So there's some really interesting stories in that early period in the 60s and 60s in particular that do engage a little bit more kind of seriously with the experiences of those characters as African Americans, as people of color. And for the most part, there's a very what people in studies of representation call colorblind. There's a very kind of colorblind approach to Black characters or any characters who are not white, and just sort of their faces are different, but everything about them is similar. And oftentimes they are playing pretty marginal roles in the show. But there are some attempts to deal with it in really interesting ways, but they stand out because they're unusual, right? So most of the time the Black characters are sort of around. And that really is true throughout much of soap history. I mean, All My Children, Michael mentioned All My Children, which in the 80s had the one of the super couples that was Black was Jesse and Angie on All My Children. And they're very beloved by lots of us, but they were certainly kind of the second tier super couple on All My Children in that era. They didn't get the kind of screen time and attention and hype as the main white super couple on that show at the time did. And so, you know, there's different shows have different patterns of this, and it's a complicated history. Starting in the 90s, there does start to be a little bit more of an effort to diversify soap casts and to bring characters of color more into stories, again, to differing degrees. It drops out again in some in the 2000s. And I think now there's only 4 soaps left on air. And, some of them are significant because they've made a greater effort to incorporate characters. The Young and the Restless is the best example of this, which is like been the top rated soap for decades, and also happens to be the soap that has more prominent African-American characters than any other soap, and all soaps have a pretty large African-American audience, but The Young and the Restless, I think, has an especially large one. And it's understandable because they've given many of those characters kind of more full treatment than we get in lots of the rest of daytime. But, race is a real problem for the history of American daytime soaps, really all of American television, of course. Thanks.
Yeah, I was thinking that too, that in a lot of ways, what you're describing mirrors the broader struggles around representation historically on television. And soap operas aren't immune from those pressures, I would say. Yeah,
for sure.
There is some fun side chatter in the chat about whether or not soap operas value older actors. I don't know if we want to make this a discussion point, but I think it stemmed from my comments about Luke. So perhaps if you want to discuss that, we can get to it at the end. But the next question is from Kumkum. And Kumkum says, thank you for this fascinating discussion. Did any soaps have international franchises? Some television serials in the 1990s were franchised with each country localizing the core plot.
Oh.
That was one I had too, Kumkum.
Yeah, no, not in that form. American daytime soaps have not done that. And actually, one of the cases I make is that one of the problems that American daytime soap opera has had since the late 80s, really, in terms of the period in which it started to decline in its popularity and profitability, is that it has failed to internationalize in the way that the rest of the television industry, American television industry, realized it really had point, definitely by the 90s. There is an exception to that, which is the soap opera The Bold and the Beautiful, which is the youngest of the soaps still on air because it began in 1987 as opposed to in the 60s or 70s. And The Bold and the Beautiful was created with the deliberate strategy of selling it internationally. And it is incredibly popular around the world still today. I think probably is more of a sensation in some other places than it is in the US even. And it was a very deliberate business strategy on the part of its creators to do that. And because it was first starting then in 1987, people around the world were able to watch it from the beginning. And part of the problem is that by the 80s, when the American TV business started to really realize the significance of international sales, they didn't, the shows had been on for so long that they weren't going to go back to 1963 and start selling episodes of General Hospital from 1963 when it started, if they even existed, internationally. And so I think that this is a real failure of the business model to have not done more international sales. And then what you're describing, the kind of format version has not happened with American daytime. There's things that have come to American TV, like Ugly Betty is probably the best known example, which was a Latin American telenovela, which circulated, as I'm sure you know, Kumkum, circulated internationally in lots of different versions and became Ugly Betty, a primetime series in the US. And so that is, one of it's definitely a big part of the story of American television more generally, is the kind of internationalization. And I think it's one of the failures of American daytime soaps. And I think it's because that for so many years, the soaps were just considered this disposable commodity that was just there to be a vehicle for ad sales, and nobody thought about them having an afterlife, such as international sales.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I was thinking of Ugly Betty too, actually, as you answered. And what I was thinking about actually is that Ugly Betty, I knew from having taught about the like transmedia migrations of texts in this moment, I knew that it started out as a telenovela, but I was realizing as you were talking that Ugly Betty did not come to the US as a soap opera. I mean, it came as sort of like a much more polished, almost a quality, it's funny, so it's sort of a sitcom, but it has much more of the markers. I mean, it was single camera, right? So it didn't have a laugh track. It was an upscaled version of that. And I guess we do have another question, so I will get to that next, but I'm jumping back in because I wonder if you can talk a little bit about like what the legacy of the soap opera is today. I mean, obviously it had profound consequences in a lot of ways for audiences, for networks, for storytelling. So you can answer in any way that you'd like, but I wonder if you want to comment on that as a way of getting towards the end of this talk.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, that's the upshot of the whole book, right? Is that this is foundational to everything about how American television, and in some ways, you know, television writ large, functions as a business, as a storytelling medium. I guess maybe I'll say a little bit about it in terms of storytelling, since we haven't talked as much about that. And I would say that it is incredibly important. I mean, I talk in the book about the influence of soap opera on primetime beginning in the 60s and 70s, when basically soap opera was so lucrative and the audiences were so devoted that the network executives were like, hey, why aren't we doing more of this in primetime? And started trying to either integrate continuing stories or started to just kind of bring some of the kind of thoughtful attention to family dynamics and relationships that was typical of daytime. So I saw one reference to the 70s sitcom One Day at a Time as being kind of influenced by the soap opera tradition. You know, it was like a sitcom. It wasn't, we wouldn't think of it as being like soaps, but just the fact that it was like an in-depth story about the relationships amongst a family, a divorced mother and her daughters, like that was seen as kind of borrowing from the legacy of soap opera. So there's so many interesting trends in television storytelling that come from the soap opera tradition. And a big part of it is that kind of serialized narrative, which is of course everywhere now, thanks to, you know, streaming and the accessibility that we have of watching episodes one after another, that has been incredibly, you know, influenced by soap opera storytelling. I mean, that's who did it first and for decades before anyone else started to tell stories that way on television. There's other forms like comic books and, you know, lots of other narrative forms that have been serialized historically, but television-wise, soap opera is really at the heart of that. And I mean, like there's serialized storytelling traditions in lots of parts of the world. So the Latin American telenovela is one example of that, of course. And that is a little bit, it's different than American soaps because they're bounded. They usually last for a few months and they end. And, you know, classic to American soaps is daytime soaps is that they never end. They just, I mean, some do eventually when they get canceled, but many of them have been on for, you know, more than 50 years. And so there's that, you know, there's those kinds of differences, but, you know, those, that's one of the differences. But that form of, I mean, telenovelas are also kind of more melodramatic typically than American daytime soaps, which despite their reputations are really pretty boring. They're really people sitting around talking most of the time. Their reputations as being very melodramatic and over the top, I mean. So that is a, yeah, so that's just a factor of how, you know, one of the many ways in which I think they've influenced TV storytelling more generally.
Okay, there's a related question. So Morgan Foster has a lovely and quite complex question that I will get to after this because Lane Hall is asking a question related to storytelling. So I want to tack that on here. He says, can you discuss the narrative structures within the soaps? They seem quite avant-garde in an odd way. And since I'm just editorializing left and right at the end of this talk, I will add that I think that's part of what is at stake for James Franco. You talk about how James Franco like wanted to be on a soap opera in the mid 2000s. And like, I always wondered why he wanted to do that, but it must be because in a way they are kind of these very unusual specimens. And he probably thought, I mean, he fancies himself an artist. So anyway,
Yeah, I don't know if you want me to get to James Franco. I could go on a rant, but I might hold off on James Franco for now. But yeah, I mean, I love that idea that they're sort of avant-garde. I mean, I get, sure, if you want to call them that, go for it. I mean, they're both incredibly conventional in so many ways in terms of their kind of ideology and their focus on very traditional structures of nuclear families and things like that. And, yet they somehow manage to tell continuing, stories that never end, that go on for decades, that are, that air 5 days a week, and that are multi-generational, right? So there's, many of the 4 remaining soaps, like many of the stories on the remaining soaps are about the children and grandchildren of characters who were on those shows in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So, I mean, that's sort of, I just don't know of any other form, a storytelling form that does that. And that's what I love so much about them as a viewer. But yeah, I think there's a lot of really, and I think because so much of it is talk, so much of it is dialogue, that there's the space and the time to really explore questions that, sometimes it's very repetitive as a result of that, but also there ends up being these little moments. And that becomes really evident when you actually go and read scripts for a particular storyline. So a story about, a character getting an abortion in the early 70s, for example. And you can see in the many conversations that character has about her circumstances, or that other characters have about her, you can see the kind of real working out of what is this thing? What are its implications? What does it mean to get an abortion? What is the morality of it? What is the legality of it? What does it mean for her status as a respectable woman? What does it mean for her marriage? What is it, all of these things. And there's few places, I think, in our culture where you get that kind of exploration and working over of ideas and questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, Morgan's question is, well, first she says, thank you, Elena. I'm enjoying this talk quite a bit, as am I. She says, I'm wondering about the turn away from socially conscious storylines. Do you think it is a way to broaden viewers by being apolitical, or are the corporate network sponsors, et cetera, discouraging political and current events and related social justice stories? Do you think the pendulum will swing back and focus on current events like GH, General Hospital, did in the 90s with Robin's HIV and other AIDS discussions?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a pendulum is a good way of talking about it, because it really varies over time. I mean, in the early years, there's not a lot of discussion of social issues. It's very, domestically focused. And that starts to change in the 60s and in the 70s in quite drastic ways, and becomes, very socially engaged most of the time, most soaps, not all. And the 80s turns away from that. Again, there's some soaps that are still, a couple soaps that still engage with those questions in the 80s, but the 80s is really more about the fantasy. And then, as you say, Morgan, in the 90s, there's kind of 2 competing trends in the 90s that I talk about in the book. There's a return to that kind of social relevance and engaging with these social issues like AIDS, race relations, rape, again, those kinds of things. And at the same time, there's a total kind of outrageous turn where you get things like the infamous devil possession story on Days of Our Lives in the 90s, and these kinds of really outlandish kinds of stories. So you have these sort of 2 divergent ways. And I think I read that in part as being a response to the declining ratings. And so an attempt to let's see what can work to draw people back in. And there were 2 very different strategies for doing that. But also kind of a response to some of the sort of oddness of 90s American culture, which I think we're just maybe starting to think about historically. We're getting far enough away from it to think about it. And it was a very interesting time, right? There's a lot of competing tensions. I could go on. I'm not going to go into a whole thing about the 90s, but so there's that. And then it really does drop out a lot again in the 2000s. I don't really have hard evidence of this, but I don't think there's been a real handing down of don't touch this topic kind of thing. I think it's much more about what can we do that people are going to enjoy or, find appealing, or it's going to keep the ratings up, especially since the 90s when the creators became more and more desperate to sustain themselves. But I do think that since 2012, which is the marker point when a bunch of soaps have been canceled and there's only 4 left, I have the sense that it's not all the time, but I do have a sense that the creators are a little like freer to sort of do what they want and see what works and try different things and be a little more bold about certain things, because they kind of have nothing to lose. Like they're all kind of, except for maybe The Bold and Beautiful, which has those robust international sales, they're kind of, you know, teetering a little bit in terms of their ability to succeed. And so you start to see things, but, you know, we live in a time where there's a lot more discussion of things like, you know, racial representation, for example, where you have more and more, you know, a recognition that we should diversify our cast more, those kinds of things. And so there's those dynamics happening too. So I think anything is kind of possible, and television, American commercial television is kind of well known. Nothing is forever, right? Like if something seems like this is the way it is now, that's going to change, and they're going to go the opposite direction to try something else, because it's all about, you know, finding the formulas for success. So sorry, that's kind of wishy-washy answer, but it's there's a lot that could happen.
Okay, thank you. We have two more, unless further ones roll in as we talk, but Kate, who helpfully alerted me to the pronunciation of her last name is Kate Flock, has another question. And Kate asks, what are your thoughts on Norman Lear's treatment of soap opera satires, Mary Hartman, and All That Glitters? Do you know if soap fans or soap creators liked his representations of the genre?
That's a great question. So I wrote about Mary Hartman in one of my earlier books, which is called Wallowing in Sex, which is about American television in the 1970s, and about kind of how television dealt with the sexual revolution. And I write about Mary Hartman there. And I mean, I love Mary Hartman. And one of the main writer of Mary Hartman, I'm going to keep you take so much time because you have to say the name twice. I'll just say it once. The main writer for Mary Hartman, the head writer, was a soap writer. Her name was Ann Marcus, and she had been the head writer of a number of daytime soaps. And Norman Lear, you know, hired her to write Mary Hartman. And so it's very, you know, she was a soap creator who made that show. And so it's very, I think it's very actually, kind of loving about soaps, and has a lot of, it borrows a lot from soaps. Obviously, it's in some ways a parody. I don't really think it's a parody. I think it's a more loving kind of take on them. And it exaggerates certain elements, but the heart of that series is really about, you know, the same things that daytime soaps are about a kind of set of relationships between a community of characters and conversations about all kinds of interesting questions and issues. So I think that it's closely connected to it. I don't know All That Glitters as well, but my sense is that it's more like a primetime soap than like a daytime soap. And I think that we tend to talk about them as one thing, but I think primetime soaps, like 80s primetime soaps, like Dynasty, Dallas, those kinds of things are quite different in lots of ways from daytime, although they exist because daytime was so successful. And my sense of All That Glitters is that it might be more in that vein. And so I don't quite have as much to say about it, but I would definitely, you know, I'm interested in learning more. It's a really interesting show. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, last question from Jonah Horwitz. I'm curious what you see as recent trends in the visual style of soap opera and how they may relate to changes in production practices and technology. Maybe this is too broad a question.
Well, we could talk more about this. I know, Jonah, offline if you want. I mean, this is really interesting because of post-COVID. Yesterday was the first post-COVID produced episode of The Bold and Beautiful aired, which I was very eager to turn on and see, which is basically, it looked great, except there's no two shots, right? Everybody is in a shot by themselves. Occasionally there was an over-the-shoulder shot where you could see the other person, which kind of flattened the distance, and they looked like they were closer to each other than they were. But I am very interested to keep watching to see how their production style is changing in this environment, which, you know, like you got to, I mean, hopefully they will continue to be safe in doing this. But anyways, it's really interesting to see how, it's not surprising to me that soaps were the first to sort of figure out how to continue to produce TV under these conditions. And hopefully they'll be able to continue to do that. Anyways, I mean, that is a big question. You know, it really changes in lots of different time periods based on technology, based on production mode in terms of live production, live on tape production, edited videotape production. You see differences in those time periods. I would say that, I mean, in general, there's a very workmanlike production style that shapes soaps always, because they have to produce a lot of content efficiently and quickly. And so there's very sort of standard, there's not a lot of innovation in terms of, you know, and they're shot in studios on sets with multiple cameras. And so there's, you know, wider shots, and then there's cross-cutting between characters in, you know, medium close-up kinds of things. But there's some really interesting moments in soap history when it comes to production style, where you see the intensification of close-ups in the 70s. It was very noticeable to me, just having watched soaps from earlier eras and then seeing some from the 70s where you have these really close-up shots. I really want to like stick my face really close to the camera now to illustrate that for you, but I'm not going to. But like incredibly close shots of faces with very little context, with broader shots. And so there's moments where that happens, and the 80s is like that as well. The use of location shooting changes that. I mean, I have a lot to say about this. It's kind of threaded throughout the book. So there's really interesting things there. But now, I mean, basically, most of the soaps are producing so much so fast because their budgets have shrunk, that they've picked up their production pace to an extent that is sort of unbelievable that they managed to do what they do. Some of the shows are producing like 7 or 8 episodes in a 5-day work week. Pre-COVID, they were doing that. We'll see what happens now. So, and yet there are some interesting moments with some like visual experimentation going on. You're like, whoa, like they can't believe they did this. And those moments really stand out because so much of soap production is so standardized that when they do things that are more kind of visually surprising or interesting, it's really noticeable and exciting for the audience, I think.
That's great. It sounds like there's more to be read about. This is a great transition. So this was just so fun. I think we should cap it here, but thank you everybody. Lovely questions, lovely discussion, fun chat in the sidebar. And if you haven't already, please get your hands on a copy of Her Stories, Daytime Soap Opera and US Television History. Thank you so much, Elana, for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks everybody. Thank you for coming and for your great questions.
Yes.
I really appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.